The moment a man decides you're replaceable is the exact moment you become unstoppable. The flashbulbs erupted like fireworks against the marble steps of the Metropolitan Museum, painting the night in gold and illusion, and at the center of it all stood Imani Carter, her hand resting gently over the quiet promise beneath her silk gown, her eyes steady despite the storm building around her, because just hours ago she had believed this night was about legacy, about charity, about standing beside her husband as equals in a world built on power and perception, but now the whispers had begun, soft at first, like wind brushing against glass, then sharper, louder, cutting through the elegance like a blade no one could see yet everyone could feel, and still she didn't move, didn't flinch, because dignity, she had learned, was not something you begged to keep, it was something you carried even when everything else was taken from you, and above her, on a stage framed by crystal chandeliers and curated applause, Lucas Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks with the precision of a man who had never second-guessed a decision, his voice smooth, controlled, perfectly measured as it echoed across a room filled with America's most powerful names. Tonight, he began, pausing just long enough for every camera to focus, every breath to hold, I'm making a personal announcement, and in that pause, something shifted, something irreversible, because the woman standing below him already knew, not from his words but from the silence that had replaced his warmth weeks ago, from the distance that had grown between them like an invisible wall no one dared to name, and yet when the word came, divorce, it didn't shatter her the way the room expected, it didn't break her into something small or pitiful, instead it landed like truth finally spoken out loud, cold but clarifying, and the crowd reacted exactly as crowds do, with gasps, with phones lifted high, with curiosity dressed as concern, because scandal was currency and tonight she had become its centerpiece. But Imani did not cry. She did not plead. She did not look up at the man who had just erased her in front of hundreds of witnesses. She simply placed her hand more firmly over her stomach, grounding herself in something real, something that did not depend on contracts or headlines or fragile promises, and then she turned, slowly, deliberately, her heels echoing against the polished stone as she walked away from the only life she had known as the wife of a billionaire, each step a quiet declaration that she would not collapse for their entertainment, that her story would not end in this room no matter how many people believed it would, and behind her the applause resumed, awkward at first, then louder, because people always choose comfort over confrontation, because it was easier to celebrate the man on stage than to question the cost of his success, but the cameras kept following her, capturing the moment from every angle as she passed beneath the towering columns and into the cool night air, a single figure framed against the city lights, and somewhere in that sea of strangers, someone whispered, she's pregnant, and the words spread faster than anything Lucas could control, faster than any narrative he could shape, and just like that, the story changed, because what had been a calculated announcement was now something else entirely, something raw, something unforgettable, and though no one in that moment could see beyond the headlines that would flood the morning news, there was something in the way she walked, steady, unbroken, undeniable, that hinted at a truth far more powerful than betrayal, a truth that would take years to unfold. Because this was not the night she lost everything, this was the night she stopped belonging to a man who never deserved her, and long after the lights dimmed and the applause faded, the image of her walking away would linger, not as a symbol of defeat, but as the first step of a story no one in that room was ready for, especially the man who thought he had just ended it. The night air felt colder than it should have as Imani stepped onto the sidewalk, the city still glowing behind her like a world she had just been written out of. And for the first time since the announcement she allowed herself a single breath that was not measured, not controlled, but real, her fingers tightening slightly over her stomach as if anchoring herself to something that could not be taken away by contracts or headlines, and the sound of her heels against the pavement slowed as the noise from the gala faded into a distant echo, replaced by the hum of passing cars and the quiet rhythm of a city that did not stop for anyone's heartbreak, because New York did not pause for grief, it demanded movement, demanded survival. And she understood that now in a way she never had before, her phone vibrating in her clutch as notifications flooded in faster than she could comprehend, messages from people she barely knew, headlines already forming stories she had not consented to tell, but she did not open a single one, because tonight was not about their narrative, it was about her next step, and that step became painfully clear when she reached the curb and realized there was no driver waiting, no familiar car door opening for her, no life waiting to welcome her back. Because everything that had once belonged to her had been quietly removed before she even had the chance to fight for it, and for a brief moment something flickered in her chest, not panic, not fear, but the sharp awareness of how completely she had been displaced. Yet even then she did not turn back, did not look toward the building where Lucas still stood under chandeliers and applause, because she knew that if she turned even once, she might hesitate, and hesitation was a luxury she could no longer afford, so instead she stepped forward into the unknown, raising her hand to hail a taxi like any other woman on the street, unnoticed, unprotected, and strangely free, the yellow cab pulling up with a soft screech as the driver leaned over to unlock the door, giving her a brief glance that carried no recognition, no judgment, just routine, and she slid inside, the leather seat cool against her skin as the door closed behind her with a quiet finality that felt louder than anything that had happened inside the gala. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice casual, ordinary, and for a second she did not answer, because the truth was she did not know, not in the way she used to, not with a penthouse address memorized and a life mapped out in certainty, and that realization settled over her like a new kind of silence, one that was not empty but waiting, and finally she spoke, giving an address that was not luxurious, not impressive, but hers alone, a small apartment she had kept quietly in her name long before marriage had promised her something bigger, something permanent, and as the taxi pulled away, the city lights blurred past the window, reflections shifting across her face, like fragments of a life already dissolving, and in that moving glass she saw herself not as the woman who had just been publicly abandoned, but as someone standing at the edge of something unformed, something uncertain, yet undeniably hers, and miles away, inside the museum, Lucas Whitmore stood surrounded by congratulations he did not fully hear, his glass untouched in his hand as conversations flowed around him, his name spoken with admiration, with approval, as if what he had done was not cruel but strategic, necessary, even admirable in the language of power, yet something in the room felt different now, something subtle but persistent, because the story he thought he had controlled was no longer contained within those walls, it had already escaped into the world beyond, carried by cameras and whispers and the quiet strength of a woman who had refused to break in front of them, and though he did not yet understand it, though he dismissed the unease settling in his chest as nothing more than the residue of a difficult decision, the truth had already begun to take shape, because the woman he believed he had left behind was not disappearing into the night, she was stepping into it, and somewhere between the fading lights of the gala and the steady motion of a taxi heading downtown, a different kind of story was beginning to write itself, one that would not ask for permission, one that would not seek validation, and one that would, in time, return to the very place it had been cast out from, not to beg for recognition, but to redefine it entirely. Morning did not arrive with comfort, it arrived with clarity, and when Imani Carter opened her eyes in the quiet stillness of her small downtown apartment, the sunlight filtering through thin curtains did not soften what had happened the night before, it revealed it, every detail sharp and undeniable, the absence louder than any memory of luxury she had once known, because there were no marble floors beneath her feet now, no skyline stretching endlessly beyond glass walls, only a modest room filled with the quiet evidence of a life she had once kept separate, a life she had never imagined would become her only one. And for a moment she lay still, one hand resting over her stomach, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, grounding herself not in what she had lost but in what remained, because that was the only truth that mattered now, and slowly she sat up, her movements deliberate, controlled, as if even the act of standing required a decision, and perhaps it did, because everything from this point forward would require one, every step, every choice, every breath would be hers alone, and the thought did not frighten her the way it might have once, instead it settled into something quieter, something steadier, like the beginning of resolve, her phone resting on the nightstand still buzzing with notifications she had ignored through the night, headlines now fully formed, narratives already decided, her name reduced to a symbol of scandal, but she did not reach for it, not yet, because she refused to let the world define her before she had the chance to define herself, and instead she stood, walking slowly across the room, the hardwood floor cool beneath her feet, the simplicity of the space almost unfamiliar after years of curated perfection, and yet there was something honest in it, something unfiltered, and as she moved toward the small mirror hanging near the doorway, she paused, studying her reflection not with vanity but with recognition, because the woman staring back at her was no longer the carefully polished image that had stood beside a billionaire at charity galas, she was something else now, something unrefined, something real, and for the first time she allowed herself to see it without resistance, the strength in her eyes not loud but present, not dramatic but undeniable, and she lifted her chin slightly, a small movement that carried more weight than any speech, because it marked a shift, subtle but permanent, from who she had been to who she was becoming, and across the city, in a glass tower that still carried his name, Lucas Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, the skyline stretching before him like a kingdom he believed he still controlled. Yet the silence around him felt heavier than usual, not because of what he had lost, but because of what he had not anticipated, the lingering image of Imani walking away replaying in his mind with an insistence he could not dismiss, her composure, her silence, the absence of chaos where he had expected it, and though he would not name it as regret, not yet, there was something in that memory that unsettled him, something that did not align with the narrative he had constructed, because in his world, outcomes were predictable, controlled, managed, and yet this felt unfinished, unresolved, as if the story had not ended where he believed it had, and he turned away from the window, adjusting his tie with the same practiced precision, returning to the rhythm of meetings and decisions, because that was what he knew, what he trusted, the structure of power that had never failed him, and still, somewhere beneath that routine, something remained, a quiet disruption he could not quite silence, while miles away, in a small apartment filled with morning light, Imani reached for a simple notebook resting on her table, opening it with steady hands as she wrote a single line across the first page, not a plan, not a plea, but a declaration, something meant only for herself, something no camera would capture, something no headline would twist, and when she finished, she closed the notebook gently, placing it down with intention, because this was not the beginning of recovery, it was the beginning of reinvention, and though no one outside that room could see it. Yet, the shift had already happened, the moment she stopped waiting for her old life to return and chose instead to build something entirely new, something that would not be granted to her but created by her, step by step, decision by decision, until one day the world that had once watched her walk away would be forced to watch her return, not as a woman seeking recognition, but as a woman who had redefined it entirely. Reinvention does not announce itself with noise, it begins in quiet rooms where no one is watching, and for Imani Carter, it began with a calendar filled not with events but with intent, each day marked not by what she had lost but by what she would build, because survival was no longer the goal, ownership was, and the difference between the two was everything. The small apartment that once felt like a fallback slowly transforming into a command center of discipline and focus, her mornings starting before sunrise, the city still dim outside her window as she sat at the table with her notebook open, mapping ideas that had once been dismissed as secondary to her role as a wife, now rising to the surface with a clarity she had never allowed herself before, concepts around consulting, strategy, community investment, things she had studied, supported, and understood deeply but had never claimed as her own, and now there was no one to ask permission from, no one to validate whether she was ready, because readiness was no longer a question, it was a decision, and each line she wrote became another piece of something that belonged entirely to her, while the world outside continued to speak about her in past tense, headlines fading into newer scandals, her name no longer trending but still remembered as a moment, a clip, a story people thought they understood, yet none of them saw the hours she spent refining her vision, the calls she made that were not returned, the meetings where she was underestimated, dismissed, politely overlooked, because the world that had once welcomed her as an extension of Lucas Whitmore did not know how to receive her as an individual force, and for a time that reality pressed against her resolve, testing it, questioning it, but it never broke it, because every time doubt surfaced, she returned to the same place, her hand resting over her growing child, a reminder that this was not just about proving something to the world, it was about building something that could not be taken away again, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift, a small opportunity here, a connection there, a single project that led to another, her work speaking louder than any introduction she could have given, her reputation no longer tied to a marriage but to her own consistency, her own discipline, her own quiet refusal to disappear, and across the city, in boardrooms filled with polished language and calculated decisions, Lucas Whitmore continued to expand his empire, numbers rising, deals closing, everything appearing exactly as it should from the outside, yet beneath that surface there was a subtle imbalance, something he could not quantify, the absence of something he had once considered insignificant now creating a space he could not fill, because the woman who had stood beside him had not simply been a presence, she had been a perspective, a grounding force he had only recognized in her absence, and though he did not speak her name, did not allow the conversation to move in that direction, there were moments, brief and uninvited, when her image surfaced, not as she had been in their life together, but as she had stood that night, composed, unshaken, walking away without looking back, and that image carried a weight he could not dismiss, because it did not align with the outcome he had expected. It did not feel like an ending, and that realization lingered longer than he was willing to admit, while in a modest office space she had recently secured, far from the glass towers of corporate power. Imani stood alone after hours, reviewing a proposal she had rewritten 3 times, her reflection faint in the window beside her, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond, and for a moment she allowed herself to pause, not in doubt but in recognition, because what stood before her was no longer an idea, it was a beginning, tangible, real, built through effort no one had witnessed, and she placed the document down, exhaling slowly as a quiet certainty settled within her, the kind that did not need validation, the kind that did not seek approval, the kind that simply existed because it had been earned. And in that moment, without announcement, without audience, the woman who had once been introduced as someone's wife had fully stepped into something else entirely, something stronger, something independent, something that would, in time, reach far beyond the walls she was standing in now, because the story she was writing was no longer about what had been taken from her, it was about what she was creating in its place. And that difference would change everything. Time did not heal her, it refined her, and 5 years moved not as a blur but as a series of deliberate steps that reshaped everything Imani Carter once believed about power, because power, she learned, was not inherited, not borrowed, and certainly not granted through proximity to a man. It was built, quietly, relentlessly, through choices made when no one was watching. And now as she stood in a sunlit office overlooking a different part of the city, one far removed from the polished towers she had once called home, there was nothing accidental about where she was. Every inch of that space carried intention, from the clean lines of the desk to the framed articles on the wall that no longer referred to her as someone's former wife but as the founder of a growing consulting firm known for turning overlooked ideas into measurable success, and her name, spoken now in boardrooms she had once been excluded from, carried a different weight, not curiosity but respect, not sympathy but recognition. And across the room, a small figure sat quietly with a tablet in his hands, his presence both grounding and motivating, a constant reminder of what she had chosen to protect and build, his eyes occasionally lifting to meet hers with a quiet trust that needed no explanation, because he did not know the full story of how they had arrived here, not yet, but he understood something deeper, something instinctive, that his mother did not bend when things became difficult, and that truth shaped him in ways words never could. And Imani allowed herself a brief pause, watching him, the softness in her expression not weakness but balance, because strength did not require her to harden, it required her to remain whole. And as she turned back to the documents in front of her, the rhythm of her work uninterrupted, the phone on her desk lit up with a name she had not seen in years, a name that once defined the trajectory of her life but now felt distant, almost irrelevant, Lucas Whitmore, the letters clear, unmistakable, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Not because she was uncertain, but because she understood exactly what this meant, not reconciliation, not regret spoken in words, but the beginning of something else, something inevitable, because success has a way of rewriting visibility, and the same world that had watched her fall now demanded to see her rise, and he, whether he admitted it or not, had been watching too, and yet her hand did not move immediately, she did not reach for the phone, did not rush to respond, because urgency no longer belonged to her, control did. And she allowed the call to ring once, twice, 3 times before it stopped, the silence that followed. Not empty but decisive, and across the city, in an office that still dominated the skyline, Lucas lowered his phone slowly, the sound of the unanswered call echoing louder than any rejection he had experienced in business, because this was not a negotiation he could strategize, not a deal he could structure, this was something else entirely, something he did not fully understand, and for the first time in a long time. He felt the absence of control in a way that unsettled him, because the woman he had once dismissed as dependent, as replaceable, had built something beyond his reach, something he could not simply step back into, and the realization did not come with anger, it came with something quieter, something more persistent, a recognition that the narrative he had constructed had shifted without his permission. And back in her office, Imani closed the file in front of her with calm precision, her focus returning exactly where it belonged. Because whatever conversation the past wanted to have with her would happen on her terms, not his, and as she glanced once more at her son, then back to the work that defined her present, there was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty in her direction, because the life she had built was not waiting for validation, it was already complete in its own right, and whatever came next would not change that, it would only reveal it to those who had failed to see it before. The second call came at exactly 9:30 the next morning, not earlier, not later, precise in a way that suggested intention rather than impulse, and this time Imani Carter did not ignore it, not because she felt obligated, but because she understood the value of timing, and timing, she had learned, was often more powerful than words. Her office quiet except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows as she picked up the phone with steady fingers, not rushing, not hesitating, simply choosing. Imani Carter speaking, her voice calm, professional, carrying none of the history that existed between them, and for a brief moment there was silence on the other end, the kind that reveals more than speech ever could, before Lucas Whitmore finally responded, his tone measured, familiar in its control yet lacking the certainty it once carried. "I was not sure you would answer," he said, and she allowed a small pause before replying, not to create tension, but to establish it. "I was not sure you would call," and the exchange settled between them like a line drawn, clear, undeniable, because this was no longer a conversation built on assumption, it was one defined by awareness, and Lucas shifted slightly, the faint sound of movement suggesting a man unused to being outside of control. "I have been following your work," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "You have built something impressive," and there it was. Acknowledgement, not of the past, not of what he had done, but of what she had become, and Imani did not rush to accept it, did not soften at the recognition, because validation from him no longer held the weight it once did. "I built something necessary," she replied, her tone steady, factual, removing any space for interpretation, and the distinction was not lost on him, because necessary implied survival, intention, purpose, things he had once underestimated, and for a moment the conversation hovered, neither moving forward nor retreating, until he spoke again, this time less controlled, more direct. "I would like to meet," and the simplicity of the request carried more complexity than he intended, because it was not just about a meeting, it was about access, about proximity, about re-entering a space he no longer occupied, and Imani understood that immediately, the implications clear, the boundaries already defined in her mind before he had even asked, and she did not answer right away, allowing the silence to do what it always does, reveal intention, measure patience, test expectation, before finally responding. "You can request a meeting through my office," the words precise, deliberate, professional, and in that moment the shift was complete, because she had moved him from personal to procedural, from someone who once dictated her life to someone who now followed her structure, and on the other end of the line, Lucas absorbed that distinction, the weight of it settling deeper than he anticipated, because he recognized what it meant, not rejection, but distance, not anger, but control, and for a brief second something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need language, because it was already understood. The past was no longer a door he could walk through, it was a place he had been left behind, and when the call ended, it did so without resolution, without closure, but with something far more significant, clarity, and as Imani placed the phone back on her desk, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, she did not dwell on the conversation, did not replay it, because it had already served its purpose, it had confirmed what she already knew, that the balance had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and across the city, Lucas stood alone in his office once more, the skyline unchanged yet somehow different, his reflection faint in the glass as he stared out over the empire he had built, realizing that for the first time in years, there was something he could not acquire, something he could not negotiate, something that existed entirely outside his reach, and that realization did not come with immediate regret, but with something slower, something more enduring, the understanding that the woman he had once dismissed as replaceable had become irreplaceable in a way he had never anticipated, not because she returned to him, but because she no longer needed to, and that difference would define everything that followed. The invitation arrived without warning, not through email, not through a casual mention, but printed on heavy ivory cardstock that carried weight before it was even opened, the kind of invitation that did not ask for attention but commanded it, and when it was placed on Imani Carter's desk that afternoon, she did not reach for it immediately, because she had learned that urgency often belonged to those who had something to prove, and she no longer lived in that space. Instead she finished reviewing the proposal in front of her, signed her name with calm precision, and only then allowed her fingers to slide across the envelope, opening it with a quiet deliberation that matched everything she had become, her eyes scanning the embossed lettering that announced the upcoming Metropolitan Museum Charity Gala, the same event, the same stage, the same room where her story had once been rewritten without her consent, And for a brief moment the memory surfaced, not as pain, not as regret, but as reference, a point in time that no longer held power over her but still carried meaning. And as she read further, the detail that followed did not surprise her, though it confirmed everything she already understood. Keynote speaker, Imani Carter, and the room around her remained still, unchanged, yet something shifted internally, not excitement, not hesitation, but recognition, because this was not an invitation to attend, it was an acknowledgement of arrival, a return not to reclaim something lost, but to stand in a space she now owned on her own terms. And across the room, her son looked up from his seat, sensing the subtle change in her expression. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but certain, and Imani met his gaze with a softness that did not weaken her strength. "Everything is exactly as it should be," she replied, her words simple, yet carrying a depth he would understand more fully one day. And as she set the invitation down, she did not linger on it, did not overanalyze what it represented, because she already knew, the past had not returned to challenge her, it had returned to witness her. And miles away, in a boardroom framed by glass and expectation, Lucas Whitmore received the same invitation, though his reaction was not as composed, his eyes pausing longer on the name printed beneath the title, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the card as the realization settled in, not slowly, but all at once, because this was no coincidence, no random selection, this was intentional, public, undeniable, and for the first time since that night years ago, he felt something shift in a way that could not be managed, because the stage he had once controlled was no longer his alone, and the narrative he believed he had concluded was about to be reopened in front of the same audience. Only this time, he was not the one holding the microphone, and as the days moved forward, preparations for the event unfolded with precision, designers, schedules, confirmations, every detail aligning as expected. Yet beneath that surface there was something else building, something unspoken yet present, because those who remembered that night had not forgotten, and those who did not would soon learn. And Imani moved through it all with the same controlled grace that had defined her transformation, selecting a gown not for spectacle but for statement, reviewing her speech not for approval but for truth, every choice intentional, every detail aligned with the version of herself she had become. And on the evening of the gala, as the city lights reflected off the polished stone of the museum steps once again, she stood at the edge of the moment, not as the woman who had been turned away, not as the figure captured in viral footage, but as someone entirely different, someone who had rebuilt not just her life, but her identity. And as the doors opened, as the cameras began to turn, as the same space that had once witnessed her exit prepared to witness her return, there was no hesitation in her step, no uncertainty in her presence, because she was not walking into the past, she was stepping into something far more powerful, a moment that did not belong to memory, but to definition, and this time, she would be the one to decide exactly how it unfolded. The room did not quiet because she entered, it quieted because everyone remembered, not all at once, not in a single moment, but in fragments that stitched together as Imani Carter stepped onto the marble floor beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed her exit, the same space now holding its breath in a way it never had before, cameras turning, conversations pausing, attention shifting not out of curiosity but recognition, and she moved through it with a calm that did not seek approval, her black gown catching the light in a way that felt less like decoration and more like declaration, every step measured, every glance controlled, because this was not a return driven by emotion, it was one defined by presence. And across the room, Lucas Whitmore saw her before anyone said her name, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly as the past and present collided in a single, undeniable image. Not the woman he had left standing beneath headlines and whispers, but someone entirely different, someone composed, self-contained, and completely outside the narrative he once controlled. And for the first time since that night, he did not look away, not because he was unbothered, but because he could not. And as Imani reached the center of the room, the host's voice rose above the lingering silence, introducing her not with reference to what had happened years ago, but with a list of accomplishments that carried weight, impact, authority, words that redefined her in front of the same audience that had once reduced her to a moment. And when she stepped onto the stage, there was no hesitation in her movement, no adjustment needed, because she did not have to become anything new, she was already there, and she allowed a brief pause before speaking, not to create drama, but to acknowledge the space, to let the room settle into what it was about to hear. And when her voice came, it was steady, clear, carrying not volume but conviction. 5 years ago, I walked out of a room like this, with nothing but certainty, she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience without searching for any one face. Because this was not about him, not anymore, not certainty about what I had lost, but certainty about what I would no longer accept, and the words landed differently than anything the room expected, not accusatory, not emotional, but precise, each sentence building not a story of pain, but a framework of transformation, and as she continued, speaking about resilience, about rebuilding, about redefining value beyond circumstance, there was no need to mention names, no need to revisit details, because the truth was already understood, woven into every word, and in the front row, Lucas listened without interruption, without movement, his expression controlled yet undeniably altered, because what he was hearing was not a version of events he could challenge, it was a perspective he could not reach. And for the first time, the distance between them was not physical, it was defined by experience, by growth, by a path he had never walked, and as the speech moved toward its close, Imani allowed a single moment of stillness, her eyes steady, her presence unwavering. Sometimes, she said, her voice softening just enough to carry weight without force, the moment you are removed from something you thought defined you, is the moment you finally meet who you were meant to be, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with understanding, with recognition, with something deeper than applause, and when the room finally responded, rising to its feet in a standing ovation that echoed against the walls, it was not for the story they had once watched unfold, it was for the woman who had rewritten it entirely. And as she stepped back from the microphone, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, there was no search for acknowledgement, no glance toward the past, because she did not need to confirm what had already been established. And as the lights reflected once more across the room, illuminating faces that now saw her differently, the shift was complete, not because she had proven anything, but because she no longer needed to, and in that moment, surrounded by recognition that could not be taken away, the woman who had once walked out in silence stood firmly in a space that now belonged to her, not by invitation, but by right. Applause fades faster than people expect, but truth lingers longer than they can ignore, and as Imani Carter stepped away from the podium, the sound of hundreds rising to their feet still echoing behind her, she did not slow her pace, did not turn back to absorb the moment, because she understood something most people in that room did not. Validation is powerful, but it is not the destination. And she had already arrived long before they decided to recognize it, the stage light softening as she moved toward the exit corridor, the energy of the room shifting once again, this time not around spectacle but around realization, and behind her, Lucas Whitmore remained standing, his hands coming together in applause not out of obligation but out of something he could no longer define as anything else, because what he had just witnessed was not a performance. It was a transformation he had not believed possible when he made his decision years ago. And as the crowd slowly settled back into their seats, conversations beginning again with a different tone, a different weight, he moved, not toward the stage, not toward the spotlight, but toward the space she had just left, his steps measured, his expression composed, yet carrying something new beneath the surface, something quieter, something unresolved. And in the corridor beyond the main hall, Imani paused only long enough to collect her coat, her reflection catching briefly in a mirrored panel, the same woman who had once stood uncertain in that space now looking back at her with a certainty that did not need confirmation, and as she turned to leave, she heard it, her name spoken not loudly, not urgently, but clearly, Imani, and she stopped, not because she felt compelled to, but because she chose to, turning slowly to face the past that had finally caught up to the present, Lucas standing a few feet away, no longer framed by status or audience, just a man standing in front of a woman he no longer understood but could no longer dismiss, and for a moment neither spoke, because some distances cannot be closed with words alone, and when he finally did, his voice carried none of the authority it once had. You built something remarkable, he said, not as a strategy, not as a negotiation, but as acknowledgement, and Imani met his gaze without hesitation, without softness, without resentment, simply present. I built what I needed, she replied, her tone steady, the same words she had spoken before now carrying even more weight in person, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was final, because everything that needed to be understood already was, and Lucas nodded slightly, not in agreement but in recognition. I misjudged you, he admitted, the words quiet, controlled, yet undeniably real, and for a second it seemed as though the past might reach for something more, an apology, an explanation, something to fill the space between what was and what could have been, but Imani did not step toward it, did not invite it, because she no longer needed it. You misjudged what I would accept, she said, the correction subtle but absolute, and in that distinction lay everything he had failed to see, because she had never been defined by his perception, only limited by it, and now that limitation no longer existed, and as the moment settled, she did not wait for a response, did not linger for closure, because closure is not something given, it is something taken, and she had already taken it, and with that, she turned, walking toward the exit where the night waited beyond the glass doors, the city lights stretching endlessly before her, familiar yet entirely new, and Lucas remained where he stood, watching not as someone who had lost something he could reclaim, but as someone who had witnessed something he could never undo, and outside, as the cool air met her skin, Imani stepped forward without hesitation, her path no longer defined by what had happened behind her but by everything that lay ahead, and though the world inside that building would continue to speak, to analyze, to remember, her story had already moved beyond them, because the greatest shift had not been her return to that room, it had been her ability to leave it again, this time not as someone walking away from loss, but as someone walking forward in complete possession of herself, and that was something no applause, no recognition, no regret could ever change.